Okay, I think this is working. Welcome to whatever this is. I don't really have a name for it. Maybe I should call it whatever this is. Um, Took me a couple minutes to figure out the live thing. Apparently, there's an entire dashboard here, and you have to uh, fill out information before the starting button will allow you to go. So, I think I got that all figured out. I have no idea what I'm looking at. There's a little tiny video of myself, but basically the purpose, and also if anybody comments or if anybody's even here, I'm not even sure where to find those things at. So don't take offense if it feels like I'm ignoring you. I'm just a little lost at the moment. Um, but basically, what I was wanting to do is take this opportunity to kind of go through what of some of the things that we've talked about this week. Every week, for those who don't know me, my name is Rick Pidcock. I write for Baptist News Global, and I host a podcast for them twice a week called Highest Power Church and State. So once a week, I release an article with them. Usually, it's about once a week, and then I do a podcast every Monday and Thursday, and we talk about a lot about religion, politics, the intersection of power, and how people use theology to justify exercising power and authority over their neighbors. And so I'd like to get into some of that. And then also, like, I do posts throughout the week. I'm regularly commenting. If you follow me here, you're probably pretty used to that. And so like this week, my article that I wrote was called "All Are Welcome Except Those We Don't Like." It was in response to a pastor named Nate Schloman who was posting some pretty offensive comments or about immigrants and about deporting people. And so I kind of compared uh, his comments he was making publicly on social media with how their church brands themselves as being welcoming to people, and then talked about where that disconnection is between the kindness and the cruelty. And so then in my two podcasts for the week, we talked about comparing the GOP's Islamophobia in light of the election of New York City Mayor Mamdani. There's been a lot of Islamophobia that's going on recently, and then also talking about the war between authoritarian Christianity and authoritarian Islam, because a lot of a lot of conservatives are promoting this Islamophobia against Islam, but then a lot of progressives, because progressives don't want to feed into that, they end up not talking so much about Islam. And so I wanted to lean into that and basically talk about how these kingdoms of Christianity and Islam and the authoritarian versions of them in particular are clashing with one another. And then in the second episode this week, which just dropped last night on Thursday, I talked about the government reopening, the Epstein files, and how the internal battles that our political parties are currently having reveal something about their values. And so the Democrats are having this internal civil war, but also the Republicans are having an internal civil war, and they're over very different things. And so, like, what is the things that they choose to fight or argue about amongst themselves reveal about the things that they value. So that's kind of the public content that I put up this week. And then there were a ton of comments or a ton of posts that I've put out as well, and I'm going to interact with those. So basically, like, I was looking at my data for this, and I had over 1,500 comments this week, and so like I don't have a ton of time to be interacting with comments. If I engaged all of these comments, I would end up never really putting anything out. And so I don't really have a ton of time for that. And then also there's I have kind of this complicated relationship with comments. So like I grew up in my early or up until like 2018 or so, I was in these conservative evangelical complementarian Calvinist spaces that I critique a lot. And so I was when I remember when I first started questioning some things, I first started mentioning I think I mentioned one time when I started questioning whether women could preach. I was like, if women spoke on Easter Sunday, on Resurrection Sunday, then why can't they maybe preach on Easter Sunday? And it was like, the most one of the most basic questions one could ask. It's not very offensive at all. Has nothing to do with questioning a lot of fundamental things, but it ended up turning into this 150 comment explosion, and people were shocked that I would even dare suggest such a thing. And so, like, for a while there, for a couple years, like, I ended up, a lot of that kind of triggered me, because these were people that I knew. They were either family or they were people that I went to church with. And so a lot of the disapproval and the disagreement I was getting, it felt like the disapproval I received in the church. And it was very triggering. And so even when I started writing for Baptist News Global, I didn't even share my articles on here for a little while because of that. And so it took some time for me to, kind of get more used to more, people who were okay with that starting to follow, starting to become friends with me, and people who weren't so shocked. And then over time, just kind of working through that. And it is still kind of it still kind of bothers me sometimes when people that I used to go to church with or a family member, publicly says something to me that's negative. But the comment section has been a it's been a complicated thing because it's been something that I've had to work through and grow through in those as I've evolved and as the people I'm connected with has evolved over time. And I tend to be more introverted actually, and so that also plays into it. But the comments that I've seen are just they're very entertaining, they're very insightful, and so I think that I they're worth interacting with, and I wanted to take some time to go through some of the posts from this week and interact with them. So I'm only going to be mentioning people's first names. I'm not going to do people's last names. I'm all my posts are public, so I'm not putting anything out that hasn't been said in public. And I don't want to embarrass anyone. I'm not going to be putting people on blast, and I also apologize if I mispronounce any names. Um, Most of them should be fine, but there may be some that I'm just not quite sure on. But I wanted to start off with a post from November 7th where I'd mentioned this song called Jesus Never Fails. And I said, I posted a video because it had popped up in my feed, and I said, wow, this was a song on a Christian cassette tape we got once from Trinity Baptist College that I always had to fast forward or get in trouble as a 20-year-old because we thought it was worldly and sensual. I haven't heard this in years, and it just showed up in my Reels suggestion. And so there were some comments on that. People were asking, Laura asked, I'd love to hear how it's worldly or sensual. Peju said, I was wondering that too. Linda said, me too. Allison said, sensual? I don't get how this could be sensual. Paul said, worldly and sensual, using too many keys on the piano keyboard, fingering the microphone suggestively. And so I wanted to address those questions because this was one of those high stress issues from my past. And Paul kind of actually, hinted at a lot of what some of the triggering points were. So, like, a lot of people, even in contemporary conservative churches, they get very triggered, especially by women on stage. They get triggered by women's voices, women uh, who sing. They're often policed. Even professional contemporary Christian musicians who sing in concerts, they're constantly evaluated for whether their voices sound too sensual. They're critiqued for how they hold the microphone. People think that it's in a suggestive way. Shannon Harris, who was Josh Harris's wife, she actually wrote a book called The Woman They Wanted, and she gets into some of this about how these people were constantly evaluating how she dressed when she was on the worship team. Um, when I led worship for 20 years, and we were always hearing from people evaluating the women, evaluating their dress, evaluating how they sung, evaluating how they danced or raised their hands or closed their eyes. We never heard any of this feedback the from men or about men. It was always about women. And so there was this basically in the fundamentalist world that I grew up in, we basically believed that God's primary characteristic was God's holiness, which we said meant that God is distinct, God is separate. And so therefore we as God's image bearers have to be distinct. We have to be separate. And so, and separate specifically from the world or worldliness, which we said was the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And specifically that part about the lust of the flesh. If something felt good to our flesh, our bodies, we saw it as suspect. I remember one time when I was at Bob Jones University, where I went to school, they had these piano uh, rooms where you could go play. One day I was playing the song that I'd written along with Psalm 46, and this guy knocks on the door, and he comes in. He asked me to play it for him, so I played it for him. And he said, after I got done, he said, "Wow, that feels really good to my flesh." And I was just like, a little creeped out. And but it was this idea that there's something that if it feels good to your body, it must be feeling good to the sinful thing called the flesh. And and that's what we believed that rock music or any type of contemporary, pop, southern gospel, country, any of that type music, we saw that as worldly because it was appealing to your flesh. And so, like, people would always talk to us about how rock music came from African witch doctors, and that's where it was invented from African witch doctors worshiping demons, and they brought those songs to America, and and so all of a sudden you're starting to see this racial component here. It's no coincidence that a lot of this was coming from conservatives who promoted segregation. And when you start to learn the history of all of this, like black people during the Civil War, they had to worship under wash bins. They had to worship in secret. And then when they were freed, they started coming out of hiding and they started being able to gather publicly together in their churches. And a lot of where they worked through their embodied wounds that they had was through their worship at church. And so they began to express themselves physically. And white people had a problem with that because they were used to black people being hidden and under wash bins. And so white people started spreading these messages about how black people's music was fleshly and sexual and satanic, and how it wasn't as holy and high as the organ music of the white people, and God is holy, and we can't, degrade the holiness of God by doing all of this worldly, fleshly stuff that the black people were doing. And so that's where a lot of these African witch doctor messages came in. It's where a lot of the fear of contemporary music came in. And so what they did was they claimed that basically God had set forth in creation this pattern of rhythm, a biblical rhythm, where biblical godly rhythm was the 1-3 beat. So it would be like a heartbeat, they said, or ocean waves, which would beat like boom pa, 1 2 3 4. And they would say what rock music does is it rebels against the biblical order, and it goes 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, and then it like amplifies it even more, so it's like 1 2 3 4, And I remember one preacher one time, he was saying how he was talking about how when you have an inferior message, you get louder. And as he was saying this, he was shouting his sermon, and I always thought that was kind of odd. So you take all that back to this Jesus Never Fails song that I shared, and it's like the version I had this really slight like click sound from a hi hat of a drum on the second and fourth beat of the chorus. And then at the end of it, it was like they had these echoes. It was like he never fails, and the way they were singing it in the echo, people were like, "Oh, that's fleshly, that's sensual," because you're kind of like getting your body into it a little bit, and so that's worldly. And so, you know, I had to, if I wanted to listen to that song, I had to do it in secret. And I hid Southern gospel cassette tapes under my mattress when I was a teenager. That's what my worldly expression was. So basically, that's kind of where the worldly and sensual comments were coming from on that. On November 8th, I shared a tweet from Adam Schefter saying that President Trump wants the Washington Commanders to name their $3.7 billion stadium after him. And we had a few comments on this. Vince said, one would hope at his age he'd realize nothing is ever going to fill his aching, all consuming need for affirmation. Judy said, he may be the neediest person on the planet. David said, release the Epstein files. That story has continued to develop this week. Phyllis said, what an insecure little man. John said, the pit of his insecure ego is insatiable and will never be filled. And then someone said, Trump has one actual talent, and it's his ability to make everything about himself. And I think all of these comments are so insightful because there's this link between hierarchy and ego. Like, when you have this hierarchy mindset of authority and submission, and that's the way you view reality, then basically ego is you're all about glorifying the person at the top, making sure they have maximum power, and that's ego. That's all about the ego. It's about making a name for yourself. You see that in the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. When the reason they were trying to build this tower into the heavens was to make a name for themselves, it says. And and so like when I look at theology, I just again, a lot when I talk about theology, I talk about it in terms of faith. I talk about it not in terms of fact because there's no way for me to prove that God is a specific way of being or even exists. But there are ways for us to say if God exists, does it make sense that God would be like this, or would it be good if God were like this? And it just doesn't make any sense to me that God would be on this ego trip from like humans on one planet in the entire universe, like that God would be most reflected in Trump, wanting to make a name for himself with the stadium. And so like I see these Trumps of the world and these men who want to make names for themselves, and I see the harm that they cause. And I just cannot imagine that they're the ones who are most reflecting what God is like. Maybe that's true. Maybe God turns out to exist and be like Donald Trump. Uh, and if so, then I reserve the right to say that's not good because of the actual effects it would have on people. And so there's a link between hierarchy and ego, and I think what a lot of like complementarians want to do, a lot of conservative evangelicals want to do, is they want to have the hierarchy and then they act surprised when ego comes along as the fruit of that seed that they're sowing. So I just think that they're inextricably linked and you can't take them apart. On November 9th, I said, meanwhile, Trump has MAGA all riled up over a post from a satirical site known as the Dunning-Kruger Times. Link in comments. And somebody named Michael shared the actual facts about this, that Barack Obama does not receive royalties linked to the Affordable Care Act. Uh, Catherine said readers duped once again by satire. This is one of those things where it's so the Dunning Kruger Times is a satire site, and the thing about satire is it's like there's satire. People often respond to it by saying, "Oh, you're building a straw man. You're not really you're going overboard." People aren't really like that. Whenever they see a satire piece, conservatives aren't really this way. Liberals aren't really this way. And while that could be true, like satire is meant to, you know, kind of be exaggerative in a way that demonstrates and illustrates something that's true. And and but what we're really concerned about is reality. And for me, like I've kind of dabbled in satire a little bit, but I kind of got tired of one. I got tired of trying to show people, oh no, this is like not just a straw man, but also like as reality started to develop, I couldn't come up with satire that was better or more out there than reality. Um, and so like I started writing about like reality based fiction stories, which maybe someone might call satire, but like John Piper, for example, he wrote this about this hypothetical situation where a man goes to a woman in a backyard and he's asking for directions to the freeway, and she has to give him directions, but in a way that doesn't compromise his mature masculinity and her femininity. And so I remember, so I decided like, okay, this is what he literally thinks complementarianism is. Let's play this out. And so I wrote an article or a short story as John Piper going on his way to a conference and getting lost and then needing directions from this woman. And so there's this woman in the backyard who he kind of like, creeps up to the fence to talk to her. And then he's trying to like get directions from her in a way that doesn't compromise his masculinity. And she has no idea that he's having all of these masculine, feminine things going on in his mind. She's just trying to give him directions to the freeway. And so it's like this humorous, story, but it's based in actual reality. Like that's not something that I just made up to make fun of John Piper. Like that's how wild reality has gotten, and how much patriarchy has just messed up basic things in life, like asking directions to the freeway. So on another post from November 9th, I said, Sean Foyt's worship warriors chanting step by step, we're taking ground in DC 10 days before the 2024 election hits differently now that we're seeing the actions of ICE. So I went to DC last October, and Sean Foyt had these worship warriors there, and they were literally chanting step by step, step by step, step by step, we're taking ground. And it was like it was kind of creepy sounding, like um and then but somebody mentioned in a comment, they said, but at least it was a peaceful assembly, unlike Antifa. And I get this from conservatives a lot. They say, well, conservatives, you may think it's weird, you may think it's creepy, but conservatives at least assemble peacefully. And to that I say, it may look that way on camera, like they weren't destroying things, but for one, all of the data shows that conservatives are 2.5 times more likely to embrace uh, violence, and to say violence is maybe necessary to save our democracy. Um, and you look at how they're what they're doing with the government. Their policies, when they actually take ground, is enacting violence. It's also not just the physical violence we're seeing through ICE, but their messages are doing violence to people's minds, to people's hearts, to through spiritual warfare. Like I've covered stories like in Seattle where these worship warriors were calling LGBTQ people the Goliaths, and they were literally picking up stones and pretending to throw rocks at these Goliaths. Like how's that going to affect a kid's mindset? A 9-year-old kid, a 10-year-old kid who is identifying as an LGBTQ kid when all of a sudden all of these adults are telling him he's got this demon on him and they're pretending to throw rocks at him. How does he know they don't have rocks? Like, that's going to scare the daylights out of him. And the whole event ended up with a bunch of police arrests and a bunch of violence. And so I think people aren't, they're not aware. When you do spiritual warfare, you are doing spiritual violence. And and I think people are not aware of the effects. A lot of their language of talking about people as demons, you're not aware of how that actually affects people. And I think people need to be more aware of that. Um, on on November 10th, I said I took this video. This is a different video at a Sean Foyt Kingdom to the Capital tour stop in October 2024. Notice how he defines worship as releasing authority to the point of bragging about being the #1 COVID violator in 29 states. He admits they don't care, and then he sings about how they're never going to stop. And now in 2025, he's partnering with the US government to plan a government sponsored worship revival tour for 2026. And Viola said, "Wow, so interesting the reframing of worship as power. Thanks, Rick, and I truly look forward to your book." So, yeah, this is how these people, uh, this is how they frame everything, like in their worship. With, you think about communion, it's one of the most sacred things to Christians. And yet they frame communion as the highest authority. The blood is the highest authority. It's a hierarchy. So like you think about the cross, and the cross is this idea that the throne is actually a cross, that the king is actually the one being crucified, and so there's a lot of this top down, up down imagery going on in the story of the cross. A lot of subversion of the empire going on, and yet what these people then do is they say rather than the cross being about Jesus' identification with those on the underside of power who are hurt by power, um, the cross is this top down highest authority thing of Jesus, of God, and so um and that's how they define everything. And so uh it's going to affect the way they even receive communion. It's really wild because when I had communion growing up, it was always everything was very quiet. It was kind of like somber, serious, and these guys are like angrily yelling, "Don't disrespect the blood," as they're taking communion. Like it's really really wild to see. Um, Grande said finally, now what in concrete and completely different images does that look like in word and practice? So like take the communion image for example. You think about in the ancient Roman world, everyone was structured as a hierarchy. Everyone knew their place in the hierarchy, and people wouldn't go up and down the hierarchy. Their places were static. They knew where they were. But then, when the hierarchy is then subverted, suddenly you have people gathering in these churches that may be a Roman centurion, or maybe, a slave, or maybe a merchant, and they're all together in this common space. And so you've got this round table, so to speak, of of a communion table. And and I think of it like Robert P. Jones talks about like how some tables have a captain's chair, and it's like even though it's a table where everyone's there, who's in charge, and it's usually a white guy. And what he was saying is that true communion and true fellowship is when everyone has a mutual belonging there. And so I think about like in our society, like what are some ways we can reflect that in society where you don't have a captain's chair. You don't have one person setting the rules for everyone else. You do have representation. When you have conservatives get really offended when uh you know a Disney character is cast as a black girl, and instead of a redheaded white girl. They'll get really offended when there's like one one lesbian couple for like a 5 to 10 second clip of a Disney movie. And it's like, it's not about being woke to have these people on. Like, we're trying to shove it down your throats. Like, there's a value in people simply having a space at the table in society, in seeing themselves represented there. And I think that there are some very practical ways that we can tell people and we can invite people into saying your voice matters. And what we're seeing a lot of today is these moments in society where we've said, "Oh, we've discounted black people for so long. Here are these black soldiers that we want to honor their sacrifice that they've brought to our country." Or, different things like that. Well, suddenly now we're getting rid of all of that. And we're saying, "Oh, that's discrimination against white people." It's discrimination against the captain's chair. There shouldn't be a captain's chair in a society based off of, especially based off of skin color, or things like that. And so I think there are ways that we can let people, we can reflect this deconstruction of the power dynamics that always protect wealthy white men, and that we can tell people, you belong, you are valued, and we're here to have a meal with you. And I think that we can do that. So, um, moving on, there was a there was a post on November 11th. I said, I don't understand the concept of men smacking women's butts in the gym. I see it at least once a week, and I never see women smacking men's butts, or each other's butts. It's always white men. Even if you're together, why would you do that? And this one got a, a bit of a variety of reactions. Michelle said, I would slap a man if he swatted my rear at the gym. Shelly said, I'd punch him in the face, not just slap him. Kat said, same, he's going to get kicked. And then Margaret said, my husband and I work together in a welding shop. We slap a butt or pinch a cheek on the way by all day long, but not in front of customers. Kat said, it's a she's mine kind of move. Um, some people said they like it when their partner does that. Other people said it makes them feel dehumanized. And so, like, I think that I know there's going to be some strong feelings about this, especially because it has to do with relationships and how you connect with the people you care about the most, and also ways you've been mistreated. And so, like, if you're in a healthy relationship, I don't want to shame some kind of healthy relationship that you have with a partner. Maybe I'm overreacting in this one. It just seems odd to me when I'm at the gym, and it's always so one way. It's never been, and maybe this is my limited experience, but it's never been men slapping other men. It's never been women slapping men or women slapping women. It's always men slapping women. And I tend to be a bit skeptical of men already to begin with. It feels like, entitlement to me. It feels like ownership when I always see it that way. And so that's why I made the comment I did. But I'm not gonna. This is not a hill I'm going to die on. If you have a healthy relationship, feel free to do what you want in your healthy relationship. But if there are guys taking advantage of women in the gym, then obviously, that needs to stop. So, um, one of the one of the uh, kind of staying on the sex theme, November 12th, I posted this Nick Fuentes video. And I said, complementarian ministries celebrate what's happening with young men, but the number one influencer of men in their 20s is this guy. Also, the Heritage Foundation, J.D. Vance, and Tucker Carlson think this guy deserves a seat at the conservative table. And so I shared this video of Nick Fuentes, and he was talking about the day of the sex robot. And basically, he came up with this idea that guys like to watch pornography, and when pornography starts going beyond digital and getting into sex robots, then basically women are going to, not be in a good situation. He talked about, and I'm euphemizing that. He talked about they're going to make Andrew Tate the president. They're going to cut women's welfare. They're going to get rid of DEI. So women are obviously not going to accomplish anything. They're not going to become lawyers ever again. They're going to have to start acting nice. And then men are going to get uh, their best sexual fantasies, the one you like the most, he says. It's going to give you perfect sex on demand for free all the time. And then women are going to be competing with that when these sex robots come. And so he said, and then you gotta cut women's welfare, so therefore they can't afford male sex robots. So obviously this one got quite a bit of responses. Aaron said he believes all men would rather not be intimate with another human being, just objects. And I think that that's something that is a real thing that we need to discuss in this topic, because there's this like there's an objectification and a commodification where it's like an economic thing for him. This isn't just about sex. This is about an economic thing. It's about a power over women. And like one of the struggles I have when this comes up sometimes is that, like, I don't think it's wrong to be visually stimulated. I think that we enjoy beauty. We enjoy, the beauty of a sunset. We enjoy the beauty of the trees. We enjoy the beauty of people. And I think there's a way that can we can hold that as true, that doesn't deny my humanity, but that also doesn't disregard someone else's humanity. And I think what he is doing is disregarding the humanity of others. And that's where the objectification and the commodification comes in. Like, objectification is the action of treating or viewing someone in a way that disregards their individuality or humanity, especially by considering them only in terms of their sexual attractiveness or availability. Commodification treats people as raw material or an agricultural product. Andrew Tate, who he talked about wanting to make president someday, he had this OnlyFans thing, and he would talk about taking these women who were, he said, I can turn them from a nobody into a cash cow. So, like, this isn't about any kind of holistic, healthy sexuality here. This is commodification. He says, he turns a nobody into a cash cow in order to put money into my bank account. So, like, that's how these guys view women. Um, they're nobodies that are there for economic gain. And so, some more comments on this. Deborah said, he's so ignorant. Trust me, bro. Women don't want to be touched by you. Women are not in competition for this jackass or anyone else that thinks like him. We are not competing, as a matter of fact. We are too busy creating communities with each other to have peace. Angie said, his vulnerability is sickening. Sadly, I probably know some boys who can shave who feel this way too. Sick. Like, yeah, I mean, I remember when the Access Hollywood tapes came out from Trump, like, um, I was at a business meeting with some Christian men, and one of the women there said, because Trump said, "Oh, this is just locker room talk," and one of the women there said, "Is this how men talk in the locker room?" And before I could say no, one of the guys immediately said yes, and then all the guys started laughing, and these were like evangelical men, and I was just shocked, like. I think there are a lot more men who think this way and talk this way than people realize. And that's why Nick Fuentes is considered the number one influencer among young men in their 20s, and that's a huge problem. Um, Talon, I believe is how you pronounce it, said, I swear not a day goes by that I don't thank the good God above that I am a queer person who has never had to deal with straight cis men. Jesus wept indeed. And that is so true. Chrissy Stroop is a transgender person who I interviewed on my podcast, and I interviewed her for my book because I have a book coming out next year, and I have a chapter on gender and sexuality and how the worship industry treats those. And one of the things she said to me was, she said queerness has always subverted those hierarchies because these men need distinct men and distinct women put in their places because their places just so happen to be one on top and one on the bottom. Men are on top. And when you start blurring those lines, it threatens, when you blur those binaries, it starts threatening their power dynamic. And so that I think is extremely true. Um, Amy said, "Ladies, you heard the man. If we build sex robots, schmucks like this will actually leave us alone, and we could make a fortune doing it too. We could get this Kickstarter funded lightning fast. Who's with me?" And Amy, if you're listening, I would be all for this. It's funny to me how I mentioned this in another post. I said it's funny how conservative Christian men ignore climate change because they say God is going to keep the human race going until the rapture, but then they panic about falling birth rates and less sex. There's just so much entitlement going on here with these men, and if women can be free of that entitlement, I'm for it. Judy said he tries to backpedal at the end, but he is dead serious. Yes, that is exactly true. This is what these guys do. You hear it in Josh Howerton all the time, pastor out of Houston. He says something sexually coercive from the pulpit during a sermon, and then he says, "Oh, I was just joking," you know. And so if you take offense to this, you're just you're not able to take a joke, and you're just so easily offended. Lisa said he has like a million followers on X and is only 27 years old. Yeah, like it would be nice to be able to ignore someone like this, but he's got a ridiculous following and he's shaping an entire generation of young men who are going to be in charge of our country. So like we kind of need to deal with this. Um, Moving on, I said when conservative evangelical white men say that everyone either bows to Jesus or bows to an idol, they're revealing that they're ignorant or unwilling to consider any reality that isn't beholden to empire. So they have nothing to transformative to offer, no matter how cool their branding may be. And that's the thing. I think this is something a lot of people are going to feel uncomfortable with because hierarchy is about authority and submission. And like I just simply cannot bring myself to talk about Jesus in a way that just turns him into another emperor. Um, and I think that a lot of times when we talk about Christian nationalism, a lot of people oppose it because they're basically just turning Jesus into another emperor. And I think that what that does is it accepts the terms of empire, and it doesn't do anything transformative to empire to just say my top guy is bigger than your top guy. Like I think we need to fundamentally uh, move beyond the assumptions of empire by subverting them and then being liberated from them. Um, this I mentioned on November 13th. I said you can't be a Christian nationalist and embody the fruit of the spirit. And Shane said, and if you think you can, it's a good way. It's a good bet that you already try to fuse love and abuse in your theology. And I think that gets to the heart of a lot of what I'm doing here. So like one of the struggles I have is I don't like when people say that Christian nationalists aren't Christian. Um, when they say things like, "Oh, those people aren't really Christian," because it has this assumption that Christians then are perfect. And and so I wanted to be a little bit more particular. Like, okay, anybody can identify as a Christian, but like the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long suffering, kindness, all of these things. Can you be kind and be putting people in their place based underneath you in perpetual submission to you because they're a woman? I don't think that you can. And when you put things like that into law for our nation, you start legislating your morality, putting people underneath you in these seven mountain mandate stuff where Christians have to be the top dogs of every realm of society. Um, you can come up with branding, you can come up with theology to make that sound good, but you're not demonstrating the fruit of the spirit. You're not demonstrating kindness. You're not demonstrating love. But of course, then love gets redefined in hierarchy as ensuring one's submission to you, ensuring one's submission to the hierarchy. And then if you look at history, it what is the higher who does the hierarchy benefit? It usually benefits straight white men. So like I don't think that you can be a Christian nationalist and embody kindness and embody joy, because then your joy, even when your joy becomes subservient to the hierarchy, you take joy in someone else's submission, and then you take joy in someone else's punishment for not submitting. And as Shane was talking about, that's where the abuse comes in. That's where the fusion of love and abuse becomes together, is when it is ensuring people's submission to your hierarchy and then punishing them with a justice of physical violence against their bodies if they don't. Um, and so there's so much entitlement going on in evangelicalism today, in a lot of Catholic Christians today as well. And it's male entitlement, it's patriarchy. It shows up in so many different ways, and it's reflected in a lot of the theology that people just assume is biblical, and it harms people. And so these were some of the conversations that we had this week, and I thought it was you guys brought some very entertaining comments and some very informative comments, and I loved interacting with them. And maybe we'll do this again sometime. I haven't like made any kind of definitive decisions or anything, but I just wanted to try it out and see how it went. I will probably go ahead and stop the recording and then see if the audio even worked. I'm assuming it did. So anyway, thanks for listening, anyone who was on.